What's going on, guys? Welcome to another episode of Bro History. It's Henry Zamota and my good friend Danny Abdeljabar. What's up, brother? How are you?
Chilling.
What's
man.
up, brother?
As per usual. How about you?
I'm doing pretty well. I do have some unfortunate news, though.
What?
So it seems that Joe, the U.S. racing pigeon, has been sentenced to death.
Who? Wait.
By the Australian government.
So, you got to run that back by me. There's a pigeon named Joe that's being sentenced to death?
Joe, the U.S. racing pigeon, has been sentenced to death. So what happened is that I like birds. I'm a big fan of birds. Yeah. I like to go to the park and watch birds. I went to go see the mandarin duck when it made its way to California.
I remember that.
Made its way, to Central Park, and I spotted it and was amazed and took many pictures. So there was a pigeon that made its way from California all the way to Australia.
Seems extremely unlikely, but okay.
Most likely it jumped on some type of ship. And it jumped out.
It didn't fly the whole way?
It didn't fly the entire way, but it ended up getting in Australia. And it had a tag on it because it was a racing pigeon. So the Australian government was able to figure out, okay, this is from America and it's from this person. They tried contacting that person. So they couldn't get in contact with the owner of the pigeon. So they sentenced it to death. And the reason being is that Australia... We have a lot of Australian listeners.
Yeah, we do.
So, maybe if I'm wrong, then let me know. But from my knowledge, they have very, very strict laws when it comes to bringing in foreign species, like foreign animal, like invasive species and invasive plant species and animal species, because they've had a long history of bringing in animals from different countries. And then them just
ruining the ecosystem.
Ruining the ecosystem. Like rabbits were brought in from Europe.
Right.
And pigs were brought in from Europe. The bullfrog was brought there. Or what was it? It was some frog that was brought there that destroyed a lot of crops. Cats there. You know, cats are not native to Australia. Right. And I think it's said that that cats have killed like at least 10 species there. Like they've
10 mammalian species.
Yeah. So they have very strict policies about bringing in these new animals.
But it's a pigeon. It's not like a murdering thing.
Well, I think it's also concerns about like what diseases this pigeon can bring in.
Let's be real. The reason why they want to get rid of it is because it's an American. They don't want none of that shit in their country. But you know what? For the Aussies out there that listen to our show, we'd like for you to petition Scott Morrison, your primey, to pardon Joe the pigeon. Please send him an email, write him a letter. Do what you got to do to get him to pardon the poor pigeon.
It just reminds me of that. Do you watch The Simpsons, or did you watch The Simpsons when you were younger?
Of course. Yeah.
Do you remember the episode where Bart ends up screwing over some Australian guy, and he has to go? I think he like runs up a really high telephone bill, calling Australia, and the guy he goes there. He has to do a public apology to the Australian Prime Minister and the public, and when he's there, he lets out a bullfrog. And then by the end of the episode, the bullfrog gets out and starts eating all the crops. And the Simpsons escape without apologizing. Like they're supposed to get like a big boot up their ass as punishment. Like there's a scene where they have to get there's a guy with a really large boot who's supposed to kick Bart. And while they're escaping, like the twist, the cliffhanger is that there's a koala attached to the helicopter. It's a classic Simpsons episode. That's what it made me think of.
It's one pigeon and it can't reproduce, asexually, and maybe it does have some diseases. I don't know, but don't kill the pigeon. Just send him back.
Fuck that pigeon.
Henry will take him.
No, fuck that pigeon. I like most animals. I hate pigeons.
But I
They're
thought you
gross.
liked birds.
But then again, I'm talking about New York City pigeons.
New York
which are
City,
probably
New York
larger.
City pigeons don't give a fuck about anyone. Like they're like just people. They don't move out of your way. They just look at you like, what? What do you want?
There used to be a pigeon that used to hang out by my windowsill, and he used to just stare at me in my room. I was just like, wow, God. That's why they introduced hawks to Manhattan.
Peregrine falcons.
20 years ago, they introduced hawks.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a lot of them there. They live up there, perched up on buildings on Central Park East.
Yeah, one lives actually near my house.
Oh, really?
I've seen its nest. The thing is fucking massive.
It's pretty cool, but
yeah,
they could get poisoned sometimes. These hawks,
because they're eating like the rats that have poison in them.
Yeah, they're eating things that eat poison. But all right, I digress. We're not talking. We got to get into the talk at hand. So there's nothing going on politically as usual. Very, very slow political environment as we were talking about last week.
Except for Joe the pigeon.
That's why we're talking about pigeons. But we wanted to do an episode on Sparta. And we were trying to find an interesting way to do this because most of Spartan history is cliche at this point, at the very least. So there is a lot of Sparta in popular culture that is over-exaggerated or just completely it's just a big myth, and it just makes for a good story. So we were trying to find an interesting way to do a podcast on this without just doing like another episode on ancient Sparta that everyone else has probably done. So we decided that there's a lot of comparisons between Sparta, at least the image of Sparta, and Nazi Germany. A lot of the qualities, a lot of the qualities that were seen as positive in Spartan society were either admired, and in some cases you can argue that they were adopted in Central Europe and in Prussia and eventually Nazi Germany.
Yep.
So I think that's an interesting way to tackle this, and we're gonna go over different analogies and different members of the Third Reich who had passionate interest in Sparta, and just some of the comparisons between Spartan organizations and Nazi organizations. So I don't know, why don't you jump into and just give us kind of like a brief overview of what at the very least, what is the popular history of Sparta? Right. We're not talking about the real history because this is ancient history, so we don't really know what the real history is. We're talking about sources from Athens who are mainly writing about Sparta at this period. There's not Spartan written history, so we're talking about the popular history right now.
Correct. One would be forgiven to think that the things that you saw in the Frank Miller comic books or the movies is real, but a lot of it is super sensationalized. But even the stuff that's not over the top and like in the movies and stuff like that, a lot of it is myth. So heavy asterisk on this quote unquote Spartan history. It's coming from third and fourth hand accounts. So
Plutarch does a lot of the Spartan history. And
exactly.
He
we
came
talked about
around
him in the last one. So yeah,
he comes around after the Roman conquest of Greece. So that's about. He writes in like the 1st century AD. So I mean, he's 4 centuries removed from the classical period in ancient Greece.
Correct. Right. So there's some stuff there. But let's step aside from that. Let's just assume that that what's important about the Spartan history is not necessarily how accurate the Spartan history was, but like that story was adopted by the Nazis in Germany. So we can start by talking about like the problem of Sparta, or the problem in Sparta, and it starts off something like this. So Sparta is a super ambitious military state, and because of that ethos that they have, they basically conquer its neighbors, right, in the regions of Messenia and Laconia, and those people who lived in that region would eventually become known by the Spartans as the Helots. A little bit more on them later, but the basic part that you need to know about them is that they worked the land for the Spartans. And the problem is that the Helots actually outnumbered the Spartans by some estimations like 10-1. And so to keep them, under lock and key, so to speak, basically every Spartan had to be a warrior. They had to be like this badass person. And, like other Greeks, they were very used to and accustomed to fighting in the phalanx formation, which we've talked about a bunch in the last couple of episodes. And that was their primary battle tactic. And this style of warfare was extremely organized and very difficult to master. And there were some distinct differences, in the circumstances with other Greeks who used the phalanx and the Spartans. So for the other Greeks, people in Athens and elsewhere, after they went to battle, they basically got to go home and go back to doing whatever it was that they were doing before they went to war, right? So if you were a farmer, you went back to being a farmer. If you were a fucking tailor, you went back to making clothes and shit. So basically for Spartans, it was different because the phalanx for them was like life. They would consistently, almost all the time, near constant warfare, right? Because
when Leonidas asked, I forget the other Greek city-state that he's talking to.
I think it was Athens.
Over to Thermopylae. Was it Athens?
Yeah.
It wasn't Athens. Was it Athens? And they were
so.
like, "What's your profession?" They're like, "I'm an artisan. Like, I'm a farmer." And then they do that chant, like, "Oh." It's like,
yeah, exactly. Spartans, what is your profession? Ho, ho, ho. Yeah, I get it. So this is where that's coming from. But basically, the general idea, like the non-movie version of this, was that they had all these enemies abroad, and they had a massive population of enslaved or quasi-enslaved Helots at the time, and
oppressed people,
like indentured servitude. I want to call it. There's some asterisks to that. So a Spartan man basically lived in this near constant warfare state, at least from the accounts that we're pulling this from. So to sum up the Spartan situation in a simple way, if you were like Sparta, you go and you conquer a bunch of people and you make a bunch of enemies by doing that. And because of that, you need your men to be crazy good at warfare and also okay with being at war like all the time. But if your men are at war all the time, who's going to do all the farming and shit? Slaves. And how do you make sure to keep up this cycle and produce generations of the best warriors all the time? The Agoge. Agoge? Agoge?
The Agoge.
The Agoge. Okay, we'll go with Agoge. All right, so the Agoge. So there's this dude, Lycurgus. He came up with this good idea called the Agoge. He was a leader, but not like a king or anything like that. Henry, I think you know a little bit about him. What was his historical title or whatever? How did he? So
he was kind of like So Lycurgus was basically like the pseudo founder of the Spartan martial system. That's what he's known for. So there's really I don't know if there's real evidence that he even existed, but he's kind of like maybe a King Arthur figure. Okay. However, he's known as the guy who came into Sparta and brought all these virtues and created systems like the Agoge that was used to train male citizens with the virtues that would not only prepare them for war, but also create good Spartan citizens in general.
Right. And as you point out, it was more than just the training of warfare. That was a big part of it, of course, right? It was a series of trials that would basically cut out the weak and cowardly Spartans. But it also was the education, right? How do we make these people stronger, smarter, things like that. Braver was important. And also it was like this society and cultural thing. It was a way to unify all the people under this military dictatorship almost, but it wasn't a dictatorship. I take that back. They had a very interesting governmental style that I want to talk about towards the end, but it's very interesting. So where were we? Oh yeah. So the Agoge, these Spartans would basically they would try to make ultimate warriors through eugenics, education, and training, right? So if you were to walk through in the life and of a Spartan from birth, you would start off as a baby, right? When you were born, they had this, which I think this is a myth. I'm not even certain, to be honest, but apparently the Spartan mothers, they would bathe their babies in wine, and evidently, the skin of a newborn is apparently pretty brittle and new, and it would burn them. It would burn the babies. It's like rubbing alcohol in an open wound, and a lot of the babies would die from this. So if they died, okay, cool, not good enough, right? So some percentage of babies were dying just because their mothers were bathing them in wine, which is already pretty brutal, just to start. And then if you survived the wine bath, then this council of elders would examine the baby pretty closely. And if they thought that the baby was sickly or weak or anything like that, anything off with the baby, they would just basically throw it off a cliff. We saw that scene also in the 300 movie. This is apparently real. This is all the weird ass eugenics of this, right?
And I was going to add something. So with infanticide, that's the practice of infanticide.
Right.
That was a pretty common practice throughout the ancient world.
Right.
I don't think that was necessarily unique to Spartan civilization.
Mm-hmm. But they would certainly adopt it. And also what's important about this particular myth history of Sparta is that they over-sensationalize the fact that the Spartans use it and report the fact that other Greek societies were doing it as well. For Nazi Germany, when we would talk about this later, it was important that they were keeping up this master race, and that's why it was so important that they had to do this baby eugenics program, when in fact everybody was doing it. So it's not exclusive, but we'll get to that part later. Anyway, so if you weren't killed as a baby, then you would probably have a somewhat normal childhood until about the age 7, and then you would get stolen from your mom, and you would get put into what's called an agala or a buai, which is basically just it translates to a herd of boys around your age. And basically they do this so that they can break the familial bond and create kind of a special Spartan child soldier family kind of bond, right? And these boys, they would often underfeed them, and they got used to being hungry, and they were encouraged to hunt and to forage and steal to feed themselves. So stealing apparently was not totally forbidden, but if you got caught, you'd get your ass beat. So it was dangerous to do it. And then around 12 years old, Spartan boys would go through this weird rite of passage where him and the other boys in his little group, the Agala, they actually had to go and steal some honey cakes from the altar of Artemis, right? I think this is another one of those fables from, what's that guy's name again?
Plutarch.
Plutarch, thank you. So basically, they were tasked to steal some honey cakes, and protecting the altar where the honey cakes were the older boys that already went through this scenario, and they had whips and shit. So the goal was to try to get the honey cakes, but you would almost always get beat to shit trying to do it. And eventually you would succeed, hopefully. If you didn't, you would probably be killed. I'm not sure exactly what happened to the kids who didn't actually get the honey cakes. But it was such a weird practice that apparently Romans used to travel for hundreds of miles just to watch this happen. Play some bets or some shit like that on it. Anyway, after
I would bet on that.
I got $10 on the one with the weird hair. So after this weird rite of passage, the boys would be awarded a cloak, like a red cape, a blood red cape called a phoenikos, fucking red Spartan cape that you see in the movie. And this is another interesting part of this. After that, that boy who just got his cape would have to choose one of the older boys who just whipped the shit out of him to complete his education. And the relationship that he would have with this boy was pretty interesting. So the older boy basically introduced him to a new clique, like a little warrior society, and he would sleep and eat and practice and fight with those kids. But also the older boy would serve as a mentor, a teacher, a comrade, and a lover. Again, we're talking about a 12-year-old boy here because, you know, you definitely want someone covering your flank in the phalanx
Mambla.
that was like statutory rape.
They practice Mambla.
Yeah, it's weird. It's like,
man boy love. But that was pretty much
it's rape.
commonly practiced in a lot of the Greek city states. But yeah, I mean,
it's rape.
It's an adult having sex with a kid and introducing them into the into Greek society.
It's
into
rape.
like intellectual Greek and whatever martial society, and they would guide them through it.
Yep, rape. Right.
Yeah,
rape.
It's rape.
So
statutory rape.
So at 18, they would get to rape their own little boy. But at 18, they would basically graduate out of this program, and they'd be known as a paidixos. These words are really hard to pronounce. And they would basically serve as like a military reservist. But to keep them like bloodthirsty, the Spartans would put them as members of this like secret police called a krypteia. And they would basically be tasked with spying on the helots and occasionally murdering them to make sure that they stayed scared, which is kind of fucked up. At age 20, Spartan would be considered a man, and then they could enter like full military service. They would be encouraged to make some babies and get a wife, but they would still be required to live in the barracks with their boys. And it wasn't until age 30 that Spartan would be released from military service, but he would still serve as a reserve fighter every now and again, which was pretty much all the time. He was allowed to leave the barracks at that point at 30, and he was also given a vote on the Spartan assembly, so they couldn't vote until they were 30. And that Spartan assembly had the final say on all of the matters of state. Actually, this part is a little bit confusing. So this is kind of like the governmental system. So they had this large body called the Spartan Assembly. It's like every Spartan above 30. It was kind of like the House of Representatives. I want to like give it kind of that kind of stature. If you were to live to 60, you can get elected to be a member of the Council of Elders. Those were the ones that like pick the babies and see if they're good. But they would also do a bunch of other things, like they would decide on pretty much all of the measures that the assembly voted on. So they had a really good degree of power because there were only 28 of them. But I guess you can think of them as kind of like the Supreme Court, right? And then there was also these two kings. This one's even more confusing. So they served as...
They had a diarchy system.
Exactly. So they had like a military king and a religious king. So think like commander-in-chief style president and like a pope kind of guy, you know, something like that. Not exactly, but like close. But then above everything else, you'd have these guys called the ephors, which is a panel of men that was elected by the assembly of Spartans, and they would oversee the government. And I guess you can consider them kind of like the Senate, but that's about as close as I can get it. It was a very interesting like system of checks and balances. There wasn't like one governing body that like had all of the power, and you know, it was kind of complicated, to be honest, but it is interesting nonetheless.
I don't think a lot of historians even really have figured out how that government was ran, or what or what were the nuances of that system, or really the anomaly of what a diarchy system was, because there's really not another society that you can point to that has two kings. You can't point another society in the world that has two kings. Mm-hmm. You could maybe point Rome, because Roman Republic had
the emperor and the pope, right?
No,
I'm mixing
before the Roman Empire. They had They had two Roman consuls. Mm-hmm. So there'd be two consuls that would be elected, and they would often be at odds with each other. It was like a checks and balance system that they had with each other, but they were elected officials. These were kings for life that were there, and there were two of them. So there's not another system like the Spartan system, like a diarchy system.
Yeah, but it was a diarchy, but it was also like an electoral system, right? Because they had this whole Spartan assembly with voting privileges that voted on representatives, you know, called the ephors. And then there was also like this like group of old dudes who were like judges, so it's like super interesting. It's very, very interesting. But I guess the point of all this, we went through the life of a Spartan, and when you think about it, like the first half of a Spartan is training, fighting, training, fighting, training, fighting, right? And the second half is like, political, like ruling, right? But if the entire population is doing nothing but training, fighting, and ruling, obviously it's not a question why they would turn to subjugation of other peoples to keep themselves fed at a bare minimum. Which kind of brings us to like the structure of Spartan society. And this will be super important when we talk more about like the connection to the Nazis, I think. But structure of Spartan society was basically a 3-tiered caste system. And so the top of the caste system was the Spartiates. They were the warriors. They were the only ones with citizenship and political power. The bottom, of course, were those slaves that I was telling you about. And kind of just above the slaves, but not quite very much above, were the helots. They basically worked the farm and they practiced different trades. And they lived mostly in the countryside. And they were kind of like indentured servants. What's interesting about this is that it let the Spartans not waste time on doing useful shit like feeding themselves and clothing themselves so that they can focus on war. But the helots actually had a couple of rights, right? Like they were a step above the slaves themselves. They can earn money, and they can even buy their freedom, but they couldn't serve in the military, and therefore they had no political power. But they were a majority of the population, which is super interesting. And then there was the merchants, the periokoi merchants. They were like incredibly necessary because there was still like ancient Greece. There was a lot of trade that happened, in the region in general, but also specifically in Greece, and trade had to happen. The slaves couldn't be merchants because a merchant needs to travel, and no slave would come back. And Lycurgus posited that Spartan warriors shouldn't be engaging in trade because it would make them soft or something like that. Like pursuing wealth would make them soft. So who's going to do the trading? Well, they put this on the merchants themselves. Now, these merchant people were free men, and they served as reserve forces, actually, for the Spartans. But they weren't considered citizens of Sparta, and they couldn't marry a Spartan. But besides acting as just straight up merchants, they were also like a buffer. So they were mostly located in the periphery of the Spartan state. So there was a bunch of these semi-autonomous cities. Think of like your Hong Kongs and stuff like that, just in the outskirts of the Spartan state. And basically they were like the gates that kept the helots in so that the helots couldn't leave. But more importantly, they were also the gates that kept foreign ideas out. It was super important to Spartan society that they do business because they needed things. However, they really didn't want outside ideas and influences to penetrate the Spartan state, and that's super, super important. So basically, these periokois, they serve two roles, right? So keep the helots in and keep dangerous ideas out. And I think this obviously it highlights some of the fragility, I think, of the Spartan system because the Spartans were so afraid of the helots leaving, which would basically eradicate their labor class. And they were also super afraid of new ideas coming in because, I mean, think about it. Their life from babyhood was like this perpetual brainwashing and this constant like lather, rinse, repeat of, indoctrination and warfare, and then eventually like this political circle jerk. So outside ideas were super bad for them. And so on the one hand, they were super fierce warriors, and on the other hand, they were terrified of new ideas. And that is the background upon which we can start making and drawing some of these comparisons and these conclusions about how the Nazis adopted a lot of these idealized and over fantasized stories of the Spartans.
So I guess from there you have to draw on 19th century Germany first. So back in the 1900s, the 1800s and 1900s, a lot of German academics, they idolized Sparta's martial qualities. And I'm going to pull this back all the way to the early 19th century. So there was this really influential book. It was called Die Dorier. And it was published by a Prussian scholar named Karl Gottfried Müller. And what the book identified was the Spartans as the leaders of the Dorian race. So what the Dorians were, that there were 4 major ethnic groups in classical Greece, along with the Eleans, the Achaeans, and the Ionians. And what Mueller believed is that the Dorians were actually a northern European race that invaded southern Greece. So the theory was used to explain the replacement of dialects and traditions in southern Greece into pre-classical times. Because after the Dark Ages in Greece around, around 1000 BC or so, there was this really big shift in the culture of Greece, and there was a change of language, there was a change of dialect, and there was these kind of evolutions that eventually led to the Greece that we think of when we think of like ancient Greece, with the columns and the marble statues and the phalanxes and all those things that come with that society. So what some classical historians were theorizing was that the invasion that created that culture change from the pre-classical Greece to classical Greece, so 5th and 4th century Greece, was from a northern European Aryan type race that invaded that. And that was one of the reasons why there was a kind of a stock market rise in those societies, because of the influx of northern Europeans. Now, how true is this? I have no idea. It doesn't really sound that true, and there's probably a lot of other explanations of why there was a transformation in that society. But that was used as kind of you can see the perceived genetic relationship between the Germans and the Spartans, and why that would be used.
That was their in route. that was
kind of their in. They're just looking for a way to identify with the Spartans, and they're like, oh yeah, like they're so awesome. Hey, and they're even us. They're even Aryans.
Right. Kind of like how I made the connection between me and the Sea Peoples.
Exactly. Yeah, you could be a sea person.
I might be,
because they could be the Philistines.
Mm-hmm.
But
sea people.
I mean, like a lot of things, this is still a mystery. But it's at times pseudo history is often used a lot in a lot of these ethno-nationalist states, especially in this region and this time of the world. Yep. You see that pre-World War One.
Right, and it wasn't exclusively Germans either. Like a lot of the European states were using kind of these over idealized, like ancient Greek and ancient Greco-Roman, allegory to help them with this or that other national identity formation.
Well, when you create a nation state, you need to draw on the past. You need to create a common culture that you can export to your society and make it an actual nation state. Mm-hmm. And to do that, you need to draw on some common ancestry. The common ancestry for a place like Italy was Rome. Mm-hmm. So the fascist imagery that we saw, and like the real like Mussolini fascism. I'm not talking about like oh, you're a fascist Nazi, like in modern times fascism. Right. I'm talking about the actual fascism that was a political ideology that came out of Italy, that drew from a lot of Roman martial societies, to create a actual nation with one identity, with one kind of purpose. It takes that type of propagandizing to take all these different unique cultures that are surrounding the area that may have nothing in common at all, to band together and have one vision. Does that make sense? Like that totally. Process is necessary. So that's why you see modern nation states use the ancient societies that they may not even have any type of linkage to to kind of promulgate that vision of nationhood and camaraderie and like togetherness and collectivism that you need to create that monopoly on violence and have that monopoly of violence be legitimate in that area. You need that. So that's why these nation states are used. Now, after World War One, the identification with Sparta's military qualities, they intensified due to the real widespread demand for the martial virtues after they had lost the war. Mm-hmm. Because every single nation state that engages in ethnic nationalism or hardcore nationalism that turns murderous, they usually have some type of humiliation story. In the case of World War II with Nazi Germany, there were multiple humiliation stories throughout their history. Mm-hmm. I mean, you can point to three right off the bat. The 30-year War. You also have the French Napoleon rolling over Prussia in all the German states in Central Europe. And then you have World War I, the ultimate humiliation story.
Right.
So, I mean, that's how you that's how you kind of propagandize and you create a nation using that type of those type of stories. And you can see that in the Middle East as well. You see a lot of those humiliation stories and the nation states that were formed in the early 20th century after the Europeans left, and usually they centered around entropements from the West or from Western imperialism. Now, at this point, after World War I, the Battle of Thermopylae had been translated to German, and it had already been translated to German for about 100 years. So the German population was really familiar with Leonidas and the Greeks and the 300 Sparta. This is Sparta.
Yeah,
They're very familiar with that story.
If I'm not mistaken, I think that was Schiller who did that.
That was Schiller?
Schiller, yeah, I think so.
So the Nazis were able to build upon these long-standing analogies between Sparta and Germany, even before the National Socialists took power.
Right.
So Hitler had been interested in Sparta since the late 1920s at the very least. So in his speeches, he would praise Spartan eugenics policy and their selective infanticide. Mm-hmm. And again, I just want to note, infanticide was probably not really unique to Sparta. Most likely it was practiced in all the Greek city-states, let alone probably most of the world at that time. Mm-hmm. Even after ancient societies. What do you do when you have a child that has some type of birth defect? Right. Most likely a family is going to leave them.
Super late term abortion.
Yeah, you'd call it that.
No, but I think what's important about this is that the fantasy around this eugenics or this infanticide project in Sparta went beyond just the I guess I'm going to cross a moral line here and say that there was it was useful to use infanticide if you saw children who were who suffered from autism or who were missing limbs or who had some certain birth defects, right? It was useful in those times because it would be difficult for you to raise those children, and then they would also become a permanent they wouldn't be able to produce in society. And so the pressures during ancient culture were much higher, which is why I think a lot of those societies would practice infanticide. But the sensationalization, however, the sensationalization of the infanticide and the eugenics projects was specifically Spartan. You know what
exactly. I mean? That's exactly what it is. So it's not that it was unique. It was a fact that the Nazis were so interested in this aspect, and they pulled that as a mark of virtue. How they selectively make population changes to create a better outcome in a better racial outcome. And to go back, Hitler had called Sparta the purest racial state in history. And one of the things that he admired about Sparta was the Helot. So the Helots were inferior. They were the inferior population. He marked that the fact that the Spartans were able to dominate a large Helot population. So, I mean, we don't really know the exact ratio, like you said earlier. It could have been 1-10. It could have been 1-4. It could have been 1-20. Who knows? Let's not cross hairs on that exact numbers, because the
They were
real
outnumbered,
experts are arguing
right?
are arguing on that
Right.
stuff. And
I think everyone agrees that they were definitely outnumbered. We just don't know by how much.
they were probably outnumbered. But Sparta was a slave master society. I mean, at least in Western context, they were a slave master society, and that was the reason why they had time to collectivize and concentrate on physical fitness and drilling and phalanxes and just doing things that were more leisure based or more I guess personally fulfilling than just working on a farm, because that's intense labor. Those are 16-hour days a week, and they'd eat up all your time.
Right.
And just take note that every Greek city-state practiced slavery. Every single one of them practiced slavery, along with pretty much the entire world would practice some type of slavery
for sure.
At this time.
But again, not the fantasization, like the fantasy about it, was very specifically Spartan.
Yeah, the fantasy was directly.
It's like, look at these Spartans, how great they were able to subjugate these, thousands and thousands of helots, right? And this worked out really well for them, because if you remember, in the excuse me, the Eastern Front during World War II, Germany wanted to push into the Slavic states, to create what was called the Lebensraum, right? So the area where they can, the lush and fertile area where they can grow all the crops, and that they can subjugate all the peoples there, so that they can feed the Greater Reich, right? And that was their idea. They wanted to do the same things that the fantasy Spartans did, right? They wanted to create a subsection of helots for themselves.
Exactly. So that's I think that's a really good comparison. So the Germans saw the Slavics specifically as helots, because Hitler said it himself. What they wanted to do is they wanted to move into Eastern Europe and populate the place with Germans and use, either get rid of the Slavic population or use them as really cheap, shitty labor. What he said about Ukraine is that he wanted to educate them just enough so that they could read the signs. That was basically it.
Right.
But what attracted the Nazis to Sparta was the elitist society, the racial organization, along with the rigorous martial education that went along with all that. And I think the key thing is, since the association between the Dorians and Germany had already been made, Sparta was seen as the perfect ancient prototype of the Nazi state that they wanted to build.
Right.
And I think it's important to take a note that, and we talked about this in other episodes, that in Central Europe around this time, this is where you see the differences between the ethnic nationalism that's formed in Central and Eastern Europe, and then the civic nationalism that's formed that in Western Europe and Britain and in America. I'm going to throw America in this, and France, where there's more of this kind of pseudo history going on in these areas. And I think it comes because there's just a lot more warfare and destruction in these states.
Right.
Now, this is where the concept of blood and soil comes in, and we've heard the
tiki
term
torches,
blood
and soil.
So Richard Walter Darr was Hitler's agriculture minister and one of the big promoters of the blood and soil ideology. And what blood and soil is just a notion that race is tied to a land. And an easy way to see if a nation subscribes to a sort of ethnic nationalism is actually to look at their immigration policies. So have you ever thought about this? When a nation provides automatic or rapid citizenship to members of a diaspora of their own dominant ethnic group, isn't that a form of ethnic nationalism?
Yeah, for sure.
So for example, I'm half Polish.
Okay.
And because my last name Zamoda is Polish, I would be able to get Polish citizenship if I filled out enough paperwork and like paid them $2,000 or something like that. It wouldn't be that expensive overall to get Polish citizenship for myself, because I would be able to trace my family roots, my family tree back to Poland very easily. Like, I have the history books. However, I don't speak Polish. Every member of my Polish side of my family is dead besides myself and my sister. And I have pretty much no culture ties to Poland either. I would still be able to easily get Polish citizenship. Not easily, but I'd be able to get Polish citizenship relatively despite all those things. Relatively easy.
It'd be easier for you to get Polish citizenship than for me to get Polish citizenship.
No, yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So there's a preference just based off my last name, my Polish, my receding hairline. They'd be able to spot that and let me in. So every Polish,
too, so.
There's a unique trait about Polish people, and I have it. It's the Polish people tend to get a receding hairline. It's a very distinct looking one. We have kind of like Cro-Magnon looking heads. Our skulls pop out a bit. We have big heads, but not much is in there. That's the stereotype about us. How do you stop a Polish cavalry?
How?
You stop the carousel. Why is there no ice in Poland?
Why?
Because the person who invented the formula died.
All right, before you get yourself in trouble with all the Polish people that listen to our show.
I'm Polish.
Yeah, well, not until you get
hey man, I can take in the age of like super hyper political correctness. I will die on the hill of making fun of my own nationalities. Like I bear the right to shit on Irish people and shit on Polish people.
Okay.
Sorry, that's just the way it works. I can say as many Irish jokes about them being drunks and Polish jokes about them being Polish. Like, yo, I'm Irish.
Oh man, that's not.
And that was like such a subconscious flip in my head. I was gonna say Polish people being stupid, but then Polish just means stupid.
Nie dobra, nie dobra. Not good.
I'm just kidding, everyone. I'm not that much of a self-hating Polak. My Irish side of my family, funny enough, are like the people who made fun of me the most for being half Polish.
Really?
So
you got bullied the most by your own family.
Yeah, I'm much closer to my mom's side of the family. So, who's Irish? They're Irish Catholic, and they used to always, all my Polish jokes I know come from them, and they're hilarious.
Right,
but there's a lot of countries like in this kind of rapid citizenship. There's a lot of countries that subscribe to this besides Poland, and basically every country in like the Balkans or Eastern Europe does this. Like Armenia, Bulgaria, Estonia, Finland, Germany, I think still does it. Greece still does this. Ireland even does this. Israel. Italy, I think you can get citizenship if your grandparents are from Italy. It's not hard to get like citizenship to your national country.
I was told once that I can get Jordanian citizenship because my father's side of the family naturalized there after I think the second Intifada, but I never followed up on that.
I mean, do you really need Jordanian citizenship?
No.
What would you do that for? What would you use that for?
I don't know.
I'm a citizen of Jordan. You can't fuck with me.
I'd go to.
Look at my passport.
I could go to Petra. I don't know. I could still go.
Let
to
me
Petra.
go to King Abdullah. He's not going to be happy about hearing this. How you treated a Jordanian citizen. Yeah. I'm going to King Abdullah. I'm a Heshemite. I
could be a Heshemite king, Henry. I could be the next Heshemite king.
I'm a Heshemite fucking king.
Okay.
Listen, you make a new state in the Middle East, I'll be that next.
Why do you think I was so anti-Bashar al-Assad?
They were going to install me. I'll be the king of Syria.
They were going to install me as this Syrian king. That was going to be me. That's why we got in such heated debates about whether or not Bashar al-Assad, gassed his own people, because I was trying to, propagate that.
I'm a monarchist. Hey guys,
secretly a monarchist.
I'm a monarchist, a Middle East monarchist. My plan is to take a crown somewhere in the Middle East. Let's carve out a little chunk of land somewhere where there's nice. We don't need to be on oil fields, but we want a place where we can at the very least slant drill into other oil fields and steal them.
Yeah. Totally.
So maybe someplace in southern, like around Kuwait or southern Iraq.
We need water access though, because I need a beach water access. Yeah.
I can think of a bunch of places. Maybe even northern Syria.
Right.
You put us up there. Yeah. We'll start a little monarchy in northern Syria, just like one small oil field up there. Mm-hmm. I think Danny has a claim to the throne.
Yep.
As a Heshemite king.
I'm the next one. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. But yeah. So where were we? We were talking about all
the countries that do this, like ethnic nationalism.
Yeah, and just the point I was trying to make is that like it still is practiced today, but in subtle ways that you don't really think about in most countries. Now, the Germans weren't just looking at Sparta in that military context. Dar was also responsible for the hereditary farm law in Germany, and I'm sure most of you guys have heard of this law. If you ever took like a World War II class or anything like that, he would praise Sparta's rural structure and the division between the Spartans and the Helots, kind of supporting a theory that Sparta was not just a state of warriors, but rather than a community of like an organized agriculture society. And according to Dar, Sparta kind of provided the paradigm for agrarian reforms in Germany, since Sparta had organized the land distribution through state control. And he was specifically influenced by Sparta's own inheritance laws. So they would pass farm from one generation to the next. Another key thing is, like another key aspect where you can draw that direct correlation is the Hitler Youth, the Adolf Hitler schools. Mm-hmm. So there was a textbook called.
Let me take that word. I'll take
you take this. You take the name of this because you speak German. And
the book is called Sparta: Der Lebenskampf einer nordischen Herrensicht, which roughly translates to. I looked this up. It's the life struggles of a Nordic ruling class.
I was wondering what the name was called.
Yeah.
The life struggles of a Nordic Sparta. The life struggles of a Nordic ruling class.
Correct.
Was the name of this book.
Yeah. Or ruling caste is an
ruling
is alternate. You can also use that word.
So it was published by a man named Otto Vacano. I think I'm pronouncing that correct.
Yeah.
And that was used in the Adolf Hitler schools. And the book painted Sparta as the ideal state to emulate. And like many Greek writers, the materials of the book, instead of teaching real history, they taught moral lessons. So a lot of the stories that came from, in our last episode, we were talking a lot about Greek historians, rather than providing a true account of things, they were more interested in creating an interesting story,
right?
So people would actually be interested in learning about it. Like,
or like the deeper meaning behind the actual history, right?
Yeah, like why was it the fate? Like, what's the deeper meaning behind?
Like why were the Persians repelled by the Greeks? Not, and they weren't talking specifically about like because of the military prowess or like because of the, the formations that they made. They were just talking about because of the, the ethos and the fighting spirit of the Greeks were matched by the Persians. Stupid shit. It's a nice story.
Exactly.
It's a nice story, is what it is, and not a.
It's a nice story. It's an interesting story. And hey, if that story was like 100% accurate, maybe we wouldn't know about it today.
Right.
When you think about it.
Yeah, maybe.
Like the story of the Battle of Plataea and the Battle of Thermopylae.
Mm-hmm.
My mom got me a book. And the book is called "The 10 Battles That That Changed the World."
Mm-hmm.
And two of the battles in the book are Thermopylae. No, I think 3 of them are Greek battles. And
was Marathon in there?
Plataea and Marathon are all in this book. It's like 10 battles that changed the world.
Mm-hmm.
And these are battles that we know a little bit about, but we don't know that much about. And however, they are so legendary and just they're still legendary in our own society. Like they're legendary battles, and they're used to still show virtue, and any marathon runner could tell you the story of how it's called a marathon because in the Battle of Marathon, they'll get excited to tell you that whole story about the Greek messenger and all that.
I don't run marathons, so I only found out about that when I did research about the Battle of Marathon.
Oh, my sister was a big time marathon runner.
Oh, really?
My girlfriend is a marathon runner too.
Cool.
My sister doesn't marathon run anymore though. She's retired. I never ran a marathon because I suck at running.
Yeah, same here. Fuck that.
I'm terrible. I'm terrible at running. I once ran a 10K though, which is about 6 miles.
I once ran a 10 block.
I ran a 10K, and that was hard enough. I mean, I've ran longer distances, but like in a race. And I got back, and my nipples were so chafed, my shirt was bleeding.
I think that's the thing, man. You got to tape them up.
Very weird.
Yeah.
And my sister had already finished. She was running like 540 miles. Like she was a very, very good runner, and she was like laughing at me. I was like, ah ha ha ha! Look at you. You're running 10-minute miles, and your nipples are chafed. You look like such a noob. It was true though.
Okay, so the book that we were talking about, right? It painted Sparta as this like ideal state to emulate, right? And that's what we were talking about before.
Yeah. So from the Nazi perspective, Lycurgus, who again is a pseudo legendary figure in Greek history, the guy who formed Sparta reformed Sparta into a martial society. The Nazis really believed his political actions not only aimed to create the martial system, but these reforms were part of a means to an end in itself. So the martial education would produce good citizens, but even if you weren't at war, they would. Or no, excuse me, I had that reversed. The martial education would produce good soldiers, but even if you weren't at war, those values taught in that martial education would create overall good conforming citizens to be part of your state. So I think that's the way that the Nazis even looked at it. Like that martial education was just a good education to have.
Right.
Like it's the best education you can get. You learn virtue, you learn toughness, you learn, strategy, how to use your brain. You learn how to be part of a unit as well. And you can make the comparison that the Hitler Youth was inspired by the Spartan agoge.
Oh yeah, undoubtedly.
Because the agoge was the education and training program that was mandated for the Spartans, and the shit that you see in 300 that we were talking about before. There's a lot of myths surrounding a lot of the stuff that we were talking about, but some of the claims about how the Agogi were acting as secret police, you can definitely draw a direct comparison to the Gestapos or to the SS as well. I have a quote from, because we were doing the research, one of the historians that has done the most work on this subject in particular is a British scholar from the early 20th century named Arnold Toynbee, and he was writing about this in the 30s and the 40s and the 50s as, you know, Hitler took power and World War II went on, and he was actually, I guess in his own words, he said he was kind of forced to do this because the Germans were studying this themselves. So, you know, he started making these comparisons, and he writes, the most horrifying feature of the Lycurgan system in non-Spartan Hellenic eyes was not its militarism, which, like Prussian militarism, differed to a degree that hardly amounted to a difference in kind from the warlike propensities of the rest of a society from which Sparta had differentiated herself in the one case, and Prussia in the other. The most appalling aspect of Spartanism was the insidious repression of an odiously penalized subject population, and the most monstrous of all Spartan institutions was a secret service that was the euphemistic official designation of an official murder gang in which adolescent Spartan boys, during the last 2 years before their coming of age, were trained to carry out a stealthy patrol of the countryside for the purpose of making away with any helots who had shown symptoms of restiveness or perhaps only vestiges of character and ability. So I think what he's doing right there is he's drawing the comparison of what the Gestapos were doing or what the SS were doing.
For sure, the SS, yeah. Mm-hmm.
And what...
The brown shirts, right?
The Ajoji, the secret police.
Right.
And if that's true, if that was a true part, then, I mean, that's it's pretty fucked up. Yeah, it's a glass of water.
Yep. I want to turn back a little bit to, you know, some of the Hitler Youth School stuff, because, you know, the parallels there between, you know, the Agogi and the system of education for the younger Spartans is pretty similar, because, you know, these Hitler had these youth schools, right? These Adolf Hitler schools, and, you know, there were for these kids between 12 and 18, and they were kind of selected to go into these schools at a pretty young age. And, you know, it started at the Hitler Youth movement on the early side of that, where they would pick people, I think in their second year of the Hitler Youth, that could be eligible to go to one of these 10 or 12 Hitler schools. And, you know, if you went through that selection process, they would basically make sure that you had a certain level of racial purity. And then, you know, if you passed that racial purity test, then you would go to a camp for a couple weeks to see if you're, you know, worthy of being part of the Adolf Hitler school. And the majority of the time that was spent there was based around like this physical training, right? I think the proportion was something like 5-1 physical training to, like, you know, regular education. And each kid had to prove themselves, or a Bewährung, which is what they needed to do to get that final review at the end, which would typically happen after 5 years, around the age of 18 or so. And if you passed, you were able to go to a university and join an officer corps and, you know, be considered for future military leadership in the Third Reich. But basically, like, the parallels are super close, right? So it's like a super young age kid, right? And take them out of there, we throw them in a camp with a bunch of other kids like them, make them kind of fight it out, right? And do a lot of heavy focus on, like, physical training. I'm sure, you know, the Nazi version of this was probably super lame in comparison to the sensationalized Spartan version, right? Like, they weren't starving their kids and, you know, making them steal from each other to eat. And they certainly, I don't think, I've never read anything like this before, but I don't think that they were having them being whipped by the older boys, or like practicing statutory rape or anything like that. I don't think that was going on. Maybe, who knows? Tell me if you've read anything about it. I'd love to also read that. But
I have not read anything about Hitler youth schools raping each other or having that kind of man-boy love
The
relationship.
closest I've ever heard about this was like this like Nazi idealization of the human body, and they were really into doing shit naked, right? Like they would do sport naked, right? They would do
Yeah, but that's just German people in general.
yeah, no, but like, they were like very.
I'm
very
driving
fucking,
like on the Autobahn, but naked.
I'm totally naked when
in a
I'm doing my
Schneider
sport.
when I get out with my wife.
Yeah, totally. We are going to go to the field and we're going to play some football and we are going to be totally naked. Don't worry.
I
about
like
it.
American football, but I like doing a two-hand touch and they're naked.
Yeah, that's like the closest you can come
Otto!
to that. That's like the closest.
Grab
you
my
can
ball sack, Otto!
But I mean, the German like this Hitler education system. Obviously, the Third Reich didn't last that long. It didn't last 1,000 years. So there weren't too many iterations of this. But one could posit that like if this had lasted for a couple.
According to
decades
CNN,
longer,
is still going on right now in America.
I'm sorry.
According to CNN, it's still going on in America.
Oh, the Third Reich. Yeah, apparently.
Yeah.
No, what I'm saying is that if it had gone on for longer, or even like 100 years or something like that, then maybe they would actually refine that, that Hitler youth program and the Hitler schools to be more Spartan-like, and it would be a little bit more cutthroat. I think making the comparisons is like it's like Spartan light, right? Like I think if all the stuff that is said about Spartans was true, and the Spartans were looking at the Hitler school and the rearing of the Hitler youth, they would probably laugh at them and say, "Wow, you guys are fucking weak." But maybe if they got around to it for longer, they would have made it more more aggressive. But I'm glad that they didn't have the chance. So that's that.
Yeah. I mean that's probably the route that they would go in, right? You suppose,
right? I think they would get more Spartan-like, like maybe they would start practicing infanticide, as a widespread practice. I mean, they kind of did. I mean, not in the fantastical way that we see, from the Spartans, but they definitely did like forced sterilizations for people who they saw as having, less than ideal genetic traits.
Yeah, America used to do that too, though.
Yeah,
I'm not defending Nazis at all.
Right.
I'm just saying that.
But the fantastical version of it was specifically German. Just like in ancient history, the many other cultures were practicing infanticide, but specifically the Spartans were famous for it. So.
A side note: when during the Nuremberg trials, when some of the Nazis who were being tried for mass extermination and stuff like that, or slaughtering people, I forget the exact context, but they quoted in their defense, they used Buck versus Bell, which was a Supreme Court case that ruled in favor of eugenic policies of a young woman who was put in I believe she was put in a school for, I forget the exact case for Buck versus Bell, but it was a young woman who was troubled. She wasn't, she didn't have any like diagnosed problems, but she was put in a home back in like the 1920s. They would just lump in people with epilepsy, blind, and a lot of people with special needs now into just one place.
Every spectrum of autism would all go to the same place, right? Mm-hmm.
But autism wasn't really even diagnosed back then.
No, but so like what we would consider autism today, yeah.
Yeah, what we would consider, I think a lot of people who would be diagnosed with autism back then would never be diagnosed and probably just have maybe some social issues, but they wouldn't really know what was the actual problem. But even people who maybe got into a lot of trouble, who came from troubled homes and acted out of trauma, were put in these type of centers, and this young woman was eventually sterilized. Eugenics was like a really popular policy, or a very popular brand of science in the
pseudoscience
in the early 20th century. It's actually kind of disturbing how widespread and agreed upon eugenics was in America.
Right.
But I guess that's a topic for another episode, probably, right?
Yeah.
That is an interesting topic.
Yep.
But Buck versus Bell is a Supreme Court case that if you're interested in learning more. But it wasn't just the Nazis who were making those comparisons. Like what I said earlier, the scholars and other observations from other countries were coming through, and it was also coming through through British society.
Mm-hmm.
They were making the analogies between Britain and Sparta and Germany. And I think part of that was they could see themselves as part of that analogy as well. Because the British, they were more like Athens when you think about it. The comparisons on face value are at the very least correct. The Athenians were a naval power in check. Mm-hmm. The British were a naval power.
Right.
They were a democracy. And most of all, they were imperialist. So the Spartans, on the other hand, they had their diarchy, two-king system. They were critics of democracy because they thought it was unstable. In contrast, though, the Athenian democracy was actually much more expansive and intruded on its neighbors a lot more than Spartan did. Mm-hmm. Sparta was just more concerned about controlling its direct kind of
neighborhood
sphere of influence rather than expanding its borders all across Greece. They were more concerned about just their area in southern Greece. The reason for the Peloponnesian Wars after the Persian Wars was because the Peloponnesian League that was dominated by Sparta was being approached on by the Athenians, like alliance system, and they wanted to nip that in the butt before because Athens was creating an empire within Greece. So those analogies are kind of correct when you think about it. But I guess they fall apart because the Germans they turned into militarized conquerors who essentially were trying to conquer massive square mile territories in Eastern Europe. Mm-hmm. So I guess that's where that analogy falls apart. But another quote from Toynbee, the Nazi-like public iniquity was the characteristic of a Lycurgian regime that fixed the impassable gulf between Lycurgian Sparta and the rest of Hellas. But there was one difference of structure, ethos, and aim between Lycurgian Sparta and a National Socialist Germany that was of crucial importance from the standpoint of these two inquisitive community neighbors. Hitler knew that the Third Reich must either conquer or perish, while the rulers of Lycurgian Sparta were actually well aware that the conquest of an empire would spell the doom of the Lycurgian regime. The difference explains why the Third Reich's term of life was one of 12 years, in contrast to Lycurgus Sparta's run of 4 centuries.
Maybe they should have stuck with the Spartan stuff and not opened up a second front.
So that's where I'm getting my point of, because I'm drawing a lot from Toynbee on this podcast. Mm-hmm. He kind of says that the whole reason why Nazi Germany failed is because maybe the Nazi Germany would have lasted if they didn't go on just conquering other countries and they didn't have that expansive militarist policies. Mm-hmm. That's where they failed ultimately, and that was their biggest deviation from Spartan society. Another quote from the book, can you help me with that again? Der Lebenskampf.
Der Lebenskampf einer nordischen Herrenschicht. It's a tough one, man. That's not an easy one.
Sparta, the Nordic caste system.
The life struggles of a Nordic ruling class or ruling caste.
So here's a quote. Without the spirit of Sparta, which inflamed the armies of the Greeks, without the art of war and the courage of Sparta, the Greeks themselves would have lost their homeland. The death of Leonidas and his 300 Spartans became an eternal example of military discipline and patriotic duty. So, where I'm drawing in right now is that Nazi propaganda used the Battle of Thermopylae, and not only did they use it to get young men into fighting spirits, be like Leonidas with his chiseled abs, they used it to actually justify their losses. Mm-hmm. So you see this comparison between Thermopylae and the Battle of Stalingrad, and there was a direct parallel drawn between the Sixth Army that was annihilated in Stalingrad, mm-hmm. and the 300 Spartans who were killed in this glorious last stand fighting the horde of slaves,
right?
Xerxes, and here's a quote from Hermann Göring, the commander of the Luftwaffe, addressing the German Air Force, addressing the military. My soldiers, most of you will have heard of a similar example from the great and formidable history of Europe. Even though at the time the numbers involved were small, ultimately there is no difference in the deeds as such. 2,500 years ago, an infinitely brave and daring man stood in a narrow pass in Greece with 300 of his men. Leonidas stood with his 300 Spartans, men from a race famed for its courageous and daring. An overwhelming majority even ever renewed, constantly engaged this small troop. The heavens darkened from the number of arrows which were shot. Then, too, it was an onslaught of hordes which crushed the Aryan men here. A formidable number of warriors were at Xerxes' disposal, but the 300 men did not yield or tremble. They fought and fought a futile battle, yet one far from futile in its significance.
That comparison is so lame. It's like they just like have this convenient story where it's like, Herodotus or who I keep forgetting this guy's name again. Help me out here.
Plutarch.
Thank you. Like Plutarch, like overly, glorified this loss that the Spartans had, and then now the Nazis have this like neat, like little allegory to say, yeah, we lost, and we lost pretty fucking bad. But
Plutarch should have saw that down the road. Yeah. Oh, hopefully,
it's
like
helping to enable some losers. Like that's what he did. He's enabling losers by making this story so awesome.
But he's also inspiring Hollywood hits.
Yeah, that's true.
Come on, man. When 300 came out, what was that, 2006?
Who knows? That was a long time ago.
Hey, say what you want.
I loved that movie. It was so entertaining.
Was incredibly entertaining.
Mm-hmm.
It was very ridiculous, but incredibly entertaining. Göring, he also twisted a famous Greek epigram for the soldiers killed at Thermopylae. So the real version is strange, or the Greek version is, stranger, when you reach Sparta, tell them that you have seen us lying here as the law commanded. And he twisted that around. When you reach Germany, tell them that you have seen us fighting at Stalingrad as the law of the safety of our people commanded us.
Also lame. Göring.
Well, I guess when you have such a huge loss like in Stalingrad,
you got to spin it somehow.
I mean, it's the turning point of World War II. It's the period in 1943. That's when the Soviets, after the Battle of Stalingrad, the Soviets went on the offensive and eventually conquered Germany and sacked Berlin and a lot of parts of Eastern Germany, and they raped and murdered and killed a lot of people on their way to Germany. Mm-hmm. I can see what's hard to do is paint the picture that this was, a defensive struggle, because the Spartans were at least defending a pass, a mountain pass, and there was a Persian invading force there.
Right.
They were confronting a force that was not native to their land, In the German case, in Sparta, they're the invading force. They're I mean, I don't know I'm not great with like World War II battle history or anything like that, but I know a lot of it had to do the Battle of Stalingrad. I know a lot of it was centered around controlling southern oil fields, and that's where the Soviet oil fields were located around in southern Russia and the Caucasus and areas like that. So I know a lot of it was to just have that strategic advantage, because Germany ends up losing World War II, or not the reason, but one of the
spoiler
big
alert.
disadvantages. One of the Germany loses World War II. Spoiler alert. We ended up nuking Berlin before they could nuke us. It was really crazy. So one of the big reasons why they lost is they were running out of oil. Like they just didn't have the energy capabilities to keep up with the United States or the Soviet Union.
Right. And their North African escapades weren't going so well either.
Yeah. And I mean, there wasn't even really major... Their oil was all coming from Romania. And as soon as the U.S. got in range, as soon as the Allied forces got in range, they would bomb the shit out of those fucking Romanian oil fields. Yeah. And not only... they were suicide missions. Like they would these were really dangerous missions. Like we're talking about like a 60% casualty rate. The air raids that were going over these German oil fields during World War II. So Germany ends up basically running out of gas during their great counteroffensive during the Battle of the Bulge, on their way to kind of split the U.S. and British forces and lock the British down into kind of they're planning during the Battle of the Bulge, and their counteroffensive was to split the U.S. and the British forces into two and annihilate the British forces in the south and hold up the U.S. forces in kind of a stalemate in the north in Belgium, and then they were going to take that army and they were going to swing it back into the Soviet Union to help on the real war, where get out, because the Western Front in World War II was kind of a freak sideshow for the Germans. But I guess that's a kind of a off-topic thing. But to kind of further make the point with the Battle of Thermopylae being this kind of narrative to control the loss, this just huge epic loss, like probably the worst loss in military history.
Yeah,
it's got to be up there. It's like the most important military loss, the worst. It's the biggest battle ever. There's no bigger battle ever. The Battle of Stalingrad. Yeah. And then you throw in,
it's the biggest battle
except Capital Raid Part 2.
Let's not go there yet. It's not the end of the show yet.
So Stalingrad is the greatest battle in all of human history, along with the Battle of the Somme and the Battle of Verdun in World War I. But I mean, the Germans were on the losing end of Stalingrad in a very humiliating way. They had you have to prime up your young men to still want to fight. You know what I mean? Right. So you got to kind of really reach into the propaganda. And it's funny because by the end of 1943, there was a German aviation unit that was inspired by Leonidas. It was called the Leonidas Staffel. And the name was chosen because the pilots in the squadron were essentially going to conduct suicide missions.
Right.
And I mean, these planes I don't think were really used that much. The German version of kamikazes, but I think that they were used towards the end of the war in 1945 when the Soviets finally were marching into Berlin. But yeah, that's kind of where these analogies cross, through their propaganda, the school systems, their land reforms, their racial, ethnic vision, their kind of their projection of racial purity on the Spartans. There's a lot of interesting parallels, I don't know what's more interesting, the actual parallels or more so the projection of their own values on this ancient society.
Yeah.
Now, after talking about that, I just kind of was clicked in my head. I think it was more of German nationalist projections of their own values onto this ancient society for them to justify a lot of the evil things that they were doing.
Right. I mean, obviously, this is like a cursory look. We could go on and on and on about the many, many parallels because these Nazis were what you could call like just Spartan, like obsessed, right? Like it was very much a part of their ethos, even though they were their own race and they were on their own thing, and they were very, very much about Germany. It's kind of funny to see how much they plagiarized, from the Spartan ideals, and this is just like a cursory look at it, and hopefully that's it was an interesting topic for you guys, and you do some more research and you find some more things. I actually really enjoyed this, Henry. I thought this was like a fun way to talk about something that has been played out, the Spartans.
Yeah, I agree. And I think one more point I want to add to this conversation. So this is what the German obsession with the Spartans had actually retarded the research. I don't mean that in the offensive way, in pejorative way. Like they slowed down the research in Spartan, like archaeological digs and things like in field surveys and things like that. The reason being is because it was so associated with Nazism. People are like, I don't want to. I'll go study Thebes or something. Like, I'm sticking my nose out of this one.
Yeah.
So a lot of the research on Sparta is like kind of dynamic at this point, meaning when that. I guess the best way to explain it is that most likely the history that a kid is learning in high school is probably like out of date at this point with all the research that's going on there now. So there's like a whole new perspective, all these new perspectives that are coming out on it. And the fact that the Nazis were obsessed with it and, used it so much within their propaganda is one of the reasons why it became a bit of a taboo topic, because I guess other nations were also kind of projecting ideals on Greek city-states, and it became pretty sour. But yeah, it's Spartan history is interesting, and it's kind of unfolding right now if you look at the research. So I'll post some sources and some papers in here for you guys to look at with some authors who are doing the research if you're interested in diving deeper into it. But yeah, this was a great topic to do it. I think this was an interesting way to kind of tackle, again, like you said, something that's been like something that's in popular history. So everyone's going to want to take a stab and putting their own narrative either on it or kind of reiterating the story of 300 and the epic glory that happened. Yeah. All right. You want to end this thing?
Hell yeah.
All right. Thanks, everyone, for listening to another episode of Bro History. I hope you enjoyed the episode. Make sure that you rate and review the podcast. Give it a 5-star review. I'm sure we pissed off some people with our last rant, but that's fine. This goes with it. It's a process of elimination when it comes to these podcasts.
You can consider this like the selection process for the Spartan babies.
Yeah, we do.
If you've made it this far, you have to give
this podcast is not only a history podcast. We do politics and foreign policy mostly. So be prepared for controversial takes and arguments. But yeah, make sure you rate and review the podcast. It's the number one way to help us grow. You can also support us on Patreon at patreon.brohistory. And just keep on sharing this podcast with your friends and family. I'm sure they'll get a kick out of it too. And yeah, that's pretty much it. Unless you have anything else to add.
No way. All right. Peace, everybody.
All right. Peace.